Hello, so this is lecture 2 for invasion ecology. Today we're talking about the language of invasion, the words that we use in invasion ecology and invasive species management. So invasive species, by definition, right, are immigrants. They're non-natives, non-indigenous species. They were moved from someplace else to someplace new. That's the first step in the pathway towards becoming invasive. But it's important to also recognize that just by definition, by being an immigrant, by being a non-native, that has a larger social context. That, when we say immigrant, we say non-native, we say invasive. We may be talking about a specific plant, but those words are used way larger than just invasion ecology. And so it's important to just kind of recognize and take a step back, remember that environmental conservation, not just invasive species management or invasion ecology, but environmental conservation much larger, is steeped in environmental racism and a racist history, right? So the idea that we need to keep some people, those people out of our pristine habitat, pristine natural areas, when we think about who those people are, they are often immigrants, they are often people of color, they are often marginalized people. And so that's what I mean talking about a racist history and environmental conservation. And not only do we have that part, but the word invasive also has a very militant connotation. So we're not only talking about the potential of interpreting immigrants as undesirable when we're talking about invasion ecology, but we're also talking about the word meaning that we need to actively, aggressively, militantly keep those immigrants out. So the accompanying reading for this lecture, and this reading does a much better job than I will do at articulating this topic. The reading is from Subramaniam chapter in 2014 in this book called Ghost Stories for Darwin. And Professor Subramaniam is a professor here at UMass in women, gender, and sexuality studies. So if you're interested in these topics, and you enjoy reading that chapter, I would encourage you to look her up, take some classes with her. So non-native is not the same as invasive. That's part of the definition of the stages of invasion ecology. In order to become invasive, you have to first be introduced from someplace else and established there, but you can stop at that non-native status without ever going on to spread and have impact on ecosystems. So non-native species are ones that have been moved by people from one place to another where they wouldn't have been able to disperse on their own. They could be good, bad, or indifferent. They could be deliberately cultivated by people or not. Invasive species have that same non-native status of being moved from one place to another by people, but they have the additional pieces of definitely being on the harmful side to people or to ecosystems and other species, that they are not cultivated, they've escaped control. So that just keeping that definition in mind is really important. And also remembering that there are plenty, and here are just a couple, plenty of non-native species that are not harmful, are not problematic. So in fact, the ring-necked pheasant is the state bird of South Dakota. That is a species native to Asia, introduced in the late 1800s. Wheat, where you get your Wheaties from, right, is native to the Middle East. So lots and lots of cultivated crops, and animals, plants and animals that we like in our landscape are not native to Massachusetts or to wherever you're living. So the question in invasion ecology then is, well, if we're lumping together or have this kind of tendency to lump together non-native and invasive, does that actually make sense? what proportion of non-native species actually go on to become invasive. So the answer to that depends on what kind of taxa you look at. So taxa means just groups of species, like plants versus animals kind of thing. If you look at plants, there is a database that has looked up all of the different plant species in the world that they could find that have been introduced and naturalized someplace else in the world. And they found 230,000 plant species that have been introduced by humans someplace else and have successfully naturalized. Of those 230,000, somewhere between 3,000 and 28,000, I know that's a wide range, but it depends who you ask as to what's weedy, what's invasive. So somewhere between 3,000 and 28,000 are actually invasive. And so that means somewhere between 1% and 10% of plants likely pass from that introduced and naturalized non-native status into invasive status. If you look at insects and vertebrates, those proportions are probably a little bit higher. So this is a graph from a paper from 2005 that looked at the success of both species establishment if they were introduced, as well as their successive spread once they were established. And these were all mostly vertebrate species, but also insects moved between North America and Europe. And so the red circles on here are showing the spread data, which exist for vertebrates in Europe. It moved between Europe and North America, and insects. And so the insect data, somewhere between 30 and 40% that were successfully established go on to spread, go on to potentially become invasive. For vertebrates, somewhere around 50% that successfully establish might then spread and potentially become invasive. So 1 to 10% plants, 30 to 40% insects, up to 50% potentially vertebrates. But still overall, the majority of non-native species are not invasive. So why do invasion scientists, invasive species managers, natural resource managers, policymakers sometimes have this kind of propensity to lump together non-natives and invasives? Well, one of the problems is that we often don't have very good lists of what's invasive, right? That those plant estimates of what's invasive, anywhere between 3,000 and 28,000, the reason that that's such a wide range is because it really depends who you ask, and different people have different opinions as to, you know, how risk averse basically they're willing to be. Some people, if you're working in a really maybe pristine natural resource area, maybe anything coming in that that you haven't seen before you would consider invasive, because you just, you know, really want to keep it as it was. But those may just be non-natives, right? So the list of species that are known to be invasive varies a lot depending on who you ask. It's also missing a lot of species because most of invasion science is focused in North America and Europe and Australia and in South Africa, not too much in the rest of Africa, not too much in South America, not too much in Central and South Asia. So we just don't know a lot of information. And so because of that, we know, right, that stopping them early is the best way to prevent invasions. And if we don't know which of those species that are coming in are going to become invasive, then that means a lot of people from the invasive invasion ecology, invasion science, and management are willing to say, just like, if there's a chance it could become invasive, we don't want it here. We want to try to eradicate anything that's non-native, or consider anything that's non-native as invasive. So the problem with that, as Professor Subramaniam describes in the book chapter reading, is that anytime that you're using this anti-invasive terminology and dialogue, that can really reinforce a larger dialogue that is focused on anti-human immigrants, right? So even if we think we're only talking about oriental bittersweet, which is the picture behind me, right, as the invasive species, the non-native species that we don't want in our landscape, just the words that we use, because they're the same words that get used to talk about human immigration, that kind of reinforces all of the various problems that go into an anti-immigrant and anti-human rights perspective. If you want to know more about this, I would really encourage you to read this article. It's a quick read in Outside Magazine called "The Green Movement is Talking About Racism. It's About Time." I will put a link to it in Moodle, but you can also just Google the title and find it. So essentially what this article is about is describing a really fraught and bleak history of environmental conservation in terms of racism and anti-immigrant behavior. So again, it's that sort of history of framing things as we're going to take this land, this natural landscape, and it's for nature, and people don't belong here, right? And when we refer to like you people not belonging here, we're not generally talking about white men not belonging there. We're talking about predominantly people of color and marginalized communities. And so that is a major problem in the conservation movement. The irony of this, of course, is that our perceptions and the reality of who cares about the environment are really distorted. So this is from an article written a couple of years ago. It was a survey of 1,200 people conducted in 2015. And so the green bars in here are how much the respondents, and you can see the different categories of people across the bottom, how much those people were concerned about the environment. And everybody ranked things on a scale of 1 to 5. So 5 would be really concerned about the environment. And then the red bars on here are how much all of the rest of the groups perceived that group as caring about the environment. And these are ordered in terms of gap between reported concern and perceived concern. So you can notice that people of color tend to fall in that gap side on the left. You've got Latinos, you've got Asians, you've got Blacks, all there on the left side of this graph, which means that those groups care, in fact, in many cases more so than the folks that we think care, the young white women, I guess, on the right side of the graph. So Latinos, Asians, Blacks care more, but we think that they don't care at all. Or care a lot less about the environment. And so that framing, that racist framing of who cares about the environment, that's going to affect who we invite to participate in discussions about environmental conservation. And that's going to continue to reinforce environmental racism and structural racism in environmental conservation. Here's another example of that. This was another survey done 2018, I think is or 2019 is when it was done. You can see the numbers in the lower left, but about 2,500 people surveyed who were grouped into Latino, Black, or white. And this is a question of how concerned you are about climate change specifically. So you can see that actually the groups that care the most about climate change are most likely to be alarmed, most likely to be concerned are Latinos and Blacks, and whites are much more likely to be doubtful or dismissive of climate change. So while we're on the topic of this kind of structural environmental racism problem, we should also talk a little bit about environmental justice in environmental conservation. So environmental justice broadly, and this is a definition from the Environmental Protection Agency. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's the EPA definition, because the EPA is in the business of creating environmental laws, regulations, and policies, but certainly environmental justice would also apply to access to the environment, access to clean air, access to clean water, lack of pollution in your environment. So this is a topic that you've probably seen in other classes, that we in the US we do not live in an environmentally just society, that marginalized communities and communities of color tend to lack access to the environment, lack clean air, lack clean water, lack an unpolluted landscape. But since this is a topic of the invasion ecology, let's focus a little bit on whether invasion ecology also has an environmental justice problem. There's not a whole lot of literature on this one, but here are just a couple of examples to get you thinking about whether, so in this case, whether developing nations bear the burden of risk for invasive species. So this was a really interesting thought piece by Drake and Keller. And what they argued was, and these guys work specifically on aquatic invasions, so marine invasions, especially those associated with ballast water. And they were arguing that because there is a directionality in terms of the movement of natural resources, so the movement of really bulky, really heavy goods tend to go from poor countries to rich countries. So the picture on the left is wood extraction from the Amazon, right? So if you have a lot of wood being extracted, a lot of mineral wealth being extracted, oil being extracted, whatever it is, and that tends to move from poor countries to rich countries, when you actually look at what that means in terms of shipping, it means that when that boat is going from a rich country to a poor country, it has to have a lot of ballast water because it's basically empty. It's not bringing goods to the poor country, it's going to extract goods from the poor country. So it's bringing with it a lot of ballast water, and that ballast water gets dumped along the coastline, along the ports of these countries where resources are being extracted. Ballast water is not needed on the route back because that boat is going to be laden with these heavy, bulky natural resources. And so because of that directionality of the resource extraction, and the reverse directionality of ballast water import and dumping, that creates a large invasion risk in ports and along coastlines, specifically in poorer developing nations. The other piece of this is that developing nations really lack policies to address those types of invasions. So this is a couple of graphs from Early et al. In 2016. And these are looking at both proactive and reactive regulations. So red, or the redder you get in either of these two graphs, that means that you have fewer or lower capacity to deal with invasions in terms of your policies and regulations. So the top one is dealing with proactive regulations, that is regulations that would stop a species from getting there before it arrives, something like the US has in terms of the APHIS inspections of shipments at the border. And the graph on the bottom is your reactive capacity. So that is laws and regulations that deal with management of invasive species once they've arrived to reduce their spread and impact. You can notice especially that there's a clear geographic trend in the lack of capacity, especially for proactive, but certainly for reactive as well, where parts of the world like Africa, South and Southeast Asia, South America, developing countries of the world do not have the invasive species regulations. And so that means if you are in the global shipping business, no matter what you're moving around, there's very little to stop you from sending dirty ballast water, from sending pallets that have Asian longhorn beetle or whatever else they've got in them, from sending crops that have diseases. There's nobody inspecting those things at the border. And so it's really and it's in your economic best interest to not bother inspecting things, to not bother treating things, because that takes time and money, right? So that means that we have an additional invasion burden in developing nations. And here's just another final example of potential environmental justice question in invasion ecology, which is a question of which one do we prioritize, human livelihoods or conservation of species threatened by an invasive species. So the Nile perch, which is a really big fish, was introduced into Lake Victoria, that's in Eastern Africa, in 1950. Came from the Nile, which seems like it's not that far away, but Africa is a lot bigger than it looks often on a map. So really, and fish also, land is a pretty big barrier for a fish. So it's hard for a fish to get to an inland lake unless it's introduced by people. The Nile perch is a top predator, which means it eats all of the smaller fish. It's got a big mouth, so it can fit pretty large fish into its mouth to eat them. The graph on the bottom is a time series. So remember, the Nile perch was first introduced in 1950. It actually took a while, about 30 years, for its population to grow enough so that it started to have an impact. But in the mid 1980s through the 1990s, its population really spiked, grew much larger in terms of the tonnage of catch of Nile perch. And at the same time, the native cichlids, so native fish in Lake Victoria, essentially crashed, went down really low. And the reason that we really care a lot about Lake Victoria and about the loss of these native cichlids is that this is actually a really cool story of a huge speciation event in Lake Victoria, as well as some of these other lakes in Africa. And it's a really recent radiation and evolution. So about 500, I think they think it's more like 700 species of cichlids in Lake Victoria all evolved from one common ancestor in the last something like 10 to 15,000 years. So that in evolutionary time is like instantaneous. So you go from 1 to 700. It's really amazing how that happened. This is more diversity in a shorter period of time than Darwin's finches. So it's just a really amazing example of fish diversity in a given location. So the super fast speciation event, you've probably seen a cichlid because they're a pretty common aquarium species. So the Nile perch has basically taken out the populations of basically all of these species. So does that tell us that the Nile perch is bad, right? So from an invasive species perspective, the Nile perch is a major problem because we've lost this huge populations of native cichlids. The problem though, right, is that it's not a one-sided conversation. Nile perch fishery in Lake Victoria is really productive, very lucrative for surrounding populations in Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania. So it's not just a story of, you know, the Nile perch is bad. This is also a story of the Nile perch is supporting large populations of people who make their living based on fishing and selling Nile perch. So which is more important? This diverse set of cichlid species, people's lives and livelihoods. So different people, and you know, it's not exactly like those two things against each other, but different people are going to have different opinions on that topic. But you need to bear in mind, we all need to bear in mind that it's not a simple one-sided argument. It's not always going to be a simple invasive species bad, anyone resisting the eradication of that invasive species must also be bad. That's not going to be a clean case when we're talking about invasion ecology. So my main recommendation here is to just keep an eye out for those nuances, that it can be common in environmental conservation to talk about these sort of practices where those people over there are doing bad things to the environment. And what we need to keep an eye out for is when and how often those people are marginalized communities, people in developing countries, communities of color. Because if we really want the environmental movement to succeed, we need to work to break down that framing of environmental racism.